Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
You ever watch someone you love get torn apart in a room full of strangers, all because of a smile that says they think they're untouchable? That's what I saw when my daughter-in-law Lisa sat there in that courtroom smirking like she'd already won while my son Daniel poured out his heart about the lies and the cheating that shattered their marriage. But then I walked in behind him quiet as a shadow, and the judge old Harlan himself locked eyes with me, his face draining of color faster than a summer storm rolling in over the plains. He leaned forward and whispered just loud enough for the front row to hear, "Evelyn, why are you here?" The air went thick. Lisa's grin froze, and her whole family twisted in their seats, staring like they'd seen a ghost from their worst family reunion. What they didn't know, what none of them saw coming, was how deep my roots ran in that town and how I was about to pull every one of them up by the handful, because after years of watching Lisa chip away at Daniel's confidence with her sharp tongue and sharper ambitions, I'd finally reached the point where sitting on the sidelines in my quiet house felt like betraying the boy I'd raised through scraped knees and late-night heart-to-hearts after his father passed too soon from that heart attack that left me juggling nursing shifts and PTA meetings just to keep the lights on in our modest home on the edge of Jefferson City, Missouri. Daniel had always been the steady one, the kind of man who fixed neighbors' cars on weekends without expecting a dime in return, his hands callous from years at the auto parts store where he rose from stocking shelves to managing the floor, all while Lisa climbed her ladder at the bank, turning loan approvals into a game of who could kiss the most rings. And it started back when he brought her home for that first family dinner 8 years ago, her laughter filling my kitchen as she praised my apple pie, but later I overheard her on the phone telling a friend it was quaint. Nothing like the gourmet spots she dreamed of dragging him to once they tied the knot. She swept him off his feet with promises of adventure and a life beyond the small-town rhythm, but underneath it all simmered her impatience with his grounded ways, like when she'd roll her eyes during his stories about rebuilding engines, calling it blue-collar busywork, while she networked at cocktail hours for promotions that meant more to her than the family they were supposed to build together. Over time, those little digs added up, especially after Sophie came along, their daughter with her wide eyes and curly hair that reminded me so much of Daniel at that age, crying through colic nights, while Lisa complained about the mess and the lack of sleep, as if motherhood was just another item on her to-do list to check off before moving on to bigger things. I'd bite my tongue through holidays where Carla, Lisa's mother, with her perfectly coiffed hair and judgments wrapped in pearl necklaces, would boast about her son Mark, the big shot lawyer in St. Louis, implying that Daniel was lucky to have married up into their circle, when really it was Lisa who'd lucked into a man who loved her through the spending sprees and the forgotten anniversaries. The divorce papers hit like a freight train 6 months ago, Lisa accusing Daniel of hiding assets and emotional neglect, all fabrications to paint her as the victim, when truth be told she'd been the one siphoning money from their joint account for spa weekends and designer clothes while he scrimped to cover Sophie's preschool tuition and braces fund. Daniel called me the night before the hearing, his voice thick with exhaustion over the crackly line from that dingy apartment he'd rented after she changed the locks, claiming he was the unstable one. He poured out how she'd mocked his testimony in preliminary meetings, smirking at every detail he shared about her affairs with that colleague from the bank, the one with the flashy car and empty promises, begging me not to come to court because it would only stir up more drama with her family, who'd already lawyered up like it was a corporate takeover instead of a marriage falling apart. But how could I stay away, curled up in my empty ranch house on Elm Street, staring at the mantle photos where Lisa's smile looked as forced as her apologies after blowing up at Daniel over nothing, my old Ford pickup keys jingling in my pocket as memories flooded back of nursing him through chickenpox and cheering at his high school graduation, the one bright spot before his father was gone, leaving me to navigate widowhood with a teenager who deserved better than a mother too tired to dream. So I loaded up at dawn, the engine rumbling along Interstate 70 through fields dotted with silos and billboards for local diners, the Tower Drive giving me time to stew over the injustices, like how Lisa had once laughed off Daniel's homemade birthday cake for Sophie, calling it amateur hour compared to the bakery specials. She insisted on wasting money that could have gone to their savings. By the time I pulled into the courthouse lot, the sun baked the asphalt, turning it into a shimmering haze that matched the heat rising in my chest, and I smoothed my simple blouse and slacks, the same ones from my husband's funeral, because some days called for the familiar armor of quiet strength, slipping through the heavy doors past the security line where the guard nodded knowingly at folks like me who'd seen too many family battles unfold in these halls. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs, the wooden benches worn smooth from years of tense hearings, and I eased into a seat at the back just as the bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harlan Whitaker," a man I'd known vaguely from church potlucks and town meetings. His face lined with the wisdom of decades on the bench, but today carrying an extra weight as Daniel took the stand, adjusting his tie with hands that trembled slightly from nerves. He began recounting the marriages, unraveling the way Lisa had dismissed his efforts to save it, suggesting counseling only after her own guilt caught up, and how she'd drained their accounts, leaving him to explain to Sophie why Christmas was lean that year, her little face falling as presents stayed wrapped under a tree bought secondhand. Every word met with Lisa's smirk from the prosecution table, her highlighted hair catching the harsh fluorescence as she leaned to whisper to Mark, who nodded with that lawyer's smirk of his own, like they held all the cards in a game rigged from the start. Harlan listened intently, his gavel tapping lightly to hush side conversations, but his eyes flicked toward the entrance, as if sensing an undercurrent building, and when Daniel stepped down, shoulders heavy with the unsaid pains of a father fighting for his child, I rose from the shadows, my footsteps measured on the creaky floor, moving to sit directly behind him, the air shifting as heads turned subtly. Harlan's gaze met mine across the room, and in that split second his composure cracked, his face paling to the shade of fresh linen, his pen clattering to the bench as he leaned forward, whispering my name. "Evelyn, why are you here?" The words slicing through the tension like a cold wind through an open window. The entire room plunged into silence, Lisa's smirk evaporating into wide-eyed shock as she twisted in her seat, Carla clutching her purse with white-knuckled grip, and Mark's confident posture slumping just a fraction, all of them staring in a panic that hinted at secrets bubbling up from the depths of our tangled histories, waiting to spill over into the light. That frozen moment in the courtroom hung in the air like the heavy scent of rain-soaked earth after a Midwest downpour, refusing to break as the Judge Harlan called for a brief recess, allowing everyone a chance to catch their breath, while I remained seated behind Daniel, my hands folded in my lap, to study the tremor of satisfaction, mixed with the sharp edge of what might come next from stirring up waters that had stayed murky for far too long in our small corner of Jefferson City, where family ties twisted tighter than the vines on the old trellis in my backyard. Daniel leaned over, whispering his gratitude for my unexpected support, even as confusion flickered in his eyes about the judge's reaction. But before I could explain anything substantial, the room began to empty, with lawyers shuffling papers and spectators murmuring speculations that bounced off the high ceilings like echoes in an empty church. After Sunday service, Lisa, rising from her table with that forced composure she'd perfected over years of turning every argument into her personal stage show, while her mother Carla gathered her designer handbag and her brother Mark shot me a glare that promised retribution for daring to insert myself into what they saw as their private demolition of my son's life. As the recess stretched into uncomfortable minutes, my mind wandered back through the layers of resentment that had built up like sediment in the Missouri River over the 8 years since Daniel first introduced Lisa to our family circle, her charm masking the undercurrent of ambition that would eventually erode the foundation of their marriage, starting with that initial dinner at my house where she complimented my roast beef and mashed potatoes with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, only to later confide in a phone call to one of her friends from the bank that small-town cooking suited Daniel's simple tastes, but not the sophisticated palate she intended to cultivate once she had him locked down in a life of upward mobility. She'd arrived in his world like a whirlwind fresh out of community college, with a degree in finance and dreams of climbing to branch manager, while Daniel, content with his role at the auto parts store where he troubleshot engines and built loyalties with customers who returned year after year, saw her drive as inspiring until it turned into criticism of his steady paycheck as insufficient for the vacations and home improvements she craved, pushing him to apply for riskier jobs that left him stressed and second-guessing his worth every time she sighed over another delayed dream. I watched it unfold from the sidelines, biting back comments during family gatherings where Carla would steer conversations toward Mark's successes in St. Louis corporate law, contrasting them with Daniel's blue-collar reliability, as if reliability were a flaw rather than the backbone of a good man, and Lisa would chime in with light-hearted jabs about how Daniel's garage tinkering kept him from networking events that could elevate them both, her words laced with that subtle superiority that made my blood simmer like overboiled coffee on a hot stove. The turning point came gradually after Sophie was born 6 years ago, her tiny cries filling their first apartment with a joy that Daniel embraced, fully changing diapers and rocking her through sleepless nights, while Lisa delegated most of the hands-on work to him, complaining that it interfered with her career trajectory and postpartum yoga classes, leaving me to step in with casseroles and babysitting shifts pulled from my retirement schedule just to give them breathing room, unaware at the time that Lisa was already eyeing exits from a marriage she viewed as a temporary alliance rather than a partnership. Over those early years, I'd swallowed my frustrations through holidays where Lisa organized elaborate parties only to exclude Daniel's input, dismissing his suggestions for potluck simplicity in favor of catered spreads that strained their budget, and family outings where she'd mock his choice of a state park picnic over a resort weekend, calling it quaintly frugal when really it was his way of stretching dollars for Sophie's future college fund, the one she'd later raid for her own indulgences without a second thought. By the time the cracks widened into full fissures 2 years before the divorce filing, I could no longer pretend neutrality, especially after overhearing Lisa on the back porch during a visit telling Carla that Daniel's loyalty was holding her back from the real opportunities waiting in the city, her voice carrying that entitled lilt that came from a childhood cushioned by her parents' construction business profits, while mine had been forged in the grit of nursing school nights and widowhoods. Quiet battles. That's when I crafted my first real act of payback, a clever little maneuver born from years of observing how Lisa operated like a chess player, always 3 moves ahead, but forgetting the board had edges. I slipped into her world under the guise of reconciliation, inviting her over for coffee one afternoon under the pretense of discussing Sophie's upcoming school enrollment, her acceptance warming her features as she arrived in a crisp blouse, expecting tea and platitudes, but instead finding me with a stack of innocuous bank statements I'd obtained through a mutual acquaintance at the credit union who owed me a favor from my hospital days. As we sat at my kitchen table, the steam from our mugs curling like unspoken accusations, I casually brought up the pattern of unauthorized charges on their joint account, the ones she'd attributed to online shopping glitches, but which traced back to her personal splurges on jewelry and salon visits, her face paling slightly as she stammered defenses about forgotten authorizations, and I nodded sympathetically, adding with a wry twist that the bank's fraud department might appreciate a heads up before things escalated into formal inquiries, especially since my friend there had a nose for irregularities that could flag more than just numbers. It wasn't outright confrontation, just enough pressure to make her sweat, mirroring the discomfort she'd inflicted on Daniel for years, and as she left with hurried goodbyes promising to handle it, I felt a spark of witty satisfaction, knowing I'd planted a seed of doubt without crossing into outright sabotage, though in hindsight that choice to meddle privately might have prolonged the inevitable pain for Sophie, who deserved parents focused on her rather than their grudges, a dilemma that tugged at me, even then making me question if my protective instincts veered too close to the vindictive side. The recess ended abruptly with the bailiff's call pulling me back to the present. As we resettled into seats, the tension coiling tighter like a spring in an old garage door, and Mark took the floor for cross-examination, wielding documents that twisted Daniel's frugal habits into evidence of financial neglect, his questions probing like a mechanic's tool seeking weak points in an engine, while Lisa watched with renewed smugness, her family a phalanx of support that amplified every accusation. Daniel answered steadily, recounting how he'd covered overdrafts from Lisa's unchecked spending without complaint until the balance tipped into resentment, but as Mark pressed on painting him as the villain in their domestic drama, Carla leaned forward whispering something to Lisa that made her nod with fierce agreement. Then suddenly Carla stood pointing an accusatory finger at me, demanding in a voice that carried across the room, "What right did I have meddling in their family's private affairs?" Like some self-appointed guardian when everyone knew meddling mothers-in-law only made divorces messier, her words dripping with the hypocrisy of a woman who'd interfered from day one. The judge hesitated, his gavel hovering as murmurs swelled, but before order could restore, Mark pulled Carla down with urgent whispers about protocol and timing, his face flushing with the effort to contain the outburst. Yet in that charged interlude I caught Harlan's gaze lingering on me again, a subtle flicker of shared history from our younger days volunteering at the county fair, where small favors and confidences had woven threads that now threatened to snag on the barbs of this trial, leaving the air thick with the promise of secrets from Lisa's family bubbling up like underground springs ready to flood the surface at any moment. The way Mark tugged Carla back into her seat with that frantic whisper only amplified the undercurrents swirling through the courtroom, turning what had been a tense cross-examination into a full-blown spectacle where every sidelong glance and stifled comment hinted at fractures ready to widen under the pressure of revelations that had simmered for years in the quiet corners of Jefferson City families like mine and Lisa's, intertwined through business deals and social circles without anyone admitting how deeply the resentments ran beneath the surface politeness. Harlan cleared his throat with a deliberate cough that silenced the murmurs echoing off the paneled walls and unexpectedly called me to the witness stand, his voice carrying the measured authority of a judge who'd presided over countless domestic battles, but today laced with an undercurrent of personal caution that made my steps toward the front feel like walking a tightrope stretched over the Missouri River during high water. Seasoned the bailiff, handing me the Bible with a nod that spoke of routine, while my mind raced through the implications of speaking truths that could either bolster Daniel's case or unravel threads from my own past I'd carefully tucked away like old letters in an attic trunk. As I settled into the hard, wooden chair, its varnish worn smooth from decades of reluctant confessions, the faint scent of polished oak mixing with the stale air of legal proceedings, I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, feeling the weight of Daniel's hopeful gaze from behind me and the piercing stares from Lisa's side, where her smirk had returned in full force, as if my presence were just another obstacle for her high-powered brother to dismantle with objections and procedural maneuvers. Harlan leaned forward over his bench, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose, and prompted me to describe my first-hand observations of the marriage from its early days through the escalating conflicts that led to this divorce, his pen poised over a yellow legal pad, as if bracing for details that might complicate his impartial facade, and I began methodically recounting how Daniel had poured his heart into building a stable home, starting with the fixer-upper they bought right after the wedding, where he spent weekends sanding floors and installing shelves, while Lisa focused on staging it for Instagram-worthy photos that showcased her decorating flair, but often overlooked the practicalities like reinforcing the roof before the first heavy snows. I wove in a touch of wry humor to ease the gravity, mentioning how I'd once arrived unannounced to find Daniel wrestling a crib together from mismatched parts scavenged from garage sales because Lisa had vetoed the pricier option, insisting they save for her professional certification courses, her laughter at his makeshift efforts ringing through the house like a bell that told the beginning of her dismissals of his hands-on approach to fatherhood and life in general. The room responded with a ripple of soft chuckles, even from some of the neutral spectators who recognized the universal frustrations of mismatched expectations in marriage, but Lisa's expression hardened, her fingers drumming on the armrest as Carla whispered furiously beside her, clearly irked that I was humanizing Daniel in ways that undercut their narrative of him as the unreliable partner holding her back from greater achievements. Seizing the opportunity to deliver a clever undercut, I leaned slightly forward, catching Lisa's eye, and elaborated on the patterns I'd witnessed in their interactions, particularly how she'd belittle his contributions during family visits, like dismissing the elaborate backyard playset he built for Sophie from recycled lumber as a cheap imitation of the store-bought swing sets her affluent friends installed, her words planting seeds of doubt in their daughter's young mind about whether daddy's love was somehow less valuable because it didn't come wrapped in shiny packaging. It struck home with satisfying precision, Lisa's cheeks flushing a deep crimson as Mark jumped up with an objection on relevance, his voice sharp, but Harlan overruled it quietly, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of The shared history from our volunteer days at the county health fair, where we'd swapped stories over lukewarm coffee about navigating loss and second chances without letting grudges define us. Emboldened, I continued detailing the holiday gatherings where Carla's offhand comments about Mark's law degree versus Daniel's trade skills had become ritualistic jabs disguised as banter, and how Lisa amplified them by suggesting Daniel pursue night classes in finance to match her world, her tone implying his current path was a dead end rather than the reliable foundation that kept their bills paid and Sophie clothed in hand-me-downs turned treasures. Satisfaction bloomed in my chest as the tide seemed to shift, whispers of sympathy murmuring through the benches toward Daniel, but then Harlan posed a probing follow-up about my knowledge of their financial entanglements, asking if I'd ever assisted with joint accounts or noticed irregularities that might explain the disputed assets. His question innocent on the surface, but opening a door I'd overlooked in my zeal to undermine Lisa. Hesitating for a beat, I admitted to reviewing statements during a tense family intervention 2 years prior where I'd spotted Lisa's unauthorized transfers to a personal savings account masked as business expenses for her side consulting gigs, her actions not just draining resources, but eroding trust in ways that left Daniel vulnerable to the very accusations now leveled against him in this trial. Mark pounced immediately, twisting my revelation to implicate Daniel for failing to monitor the accounts sooner, painting him as negligent rather than victimized, and as the cross-examination dragged on with pointed questions about why I hadn't reported the discrepancies earlier, I felt the backfire acutely. The clever testimony I'd crafted now casting shadows over my son's character in subtle ways that made my stomach knot with regret, realizing that in my pursuit of witty revenge I'd risked amplifying the pain for Sophie, who sat in the back with a court-appointed advocate, her small face pale and confused by the adult wars raging around her. Viewers tuning into this tale might start siding against my choices at that point, questioning the morality of a mother-in-law whose interventions blurred the line between advocacy and vengeance, potentially prolonging the custody battle for a little girl caught in the crossfire. But the internal conflict only steeled my resolve as the session wound toward its midpoint, the air thick with unresolved tensions and Harlan's growing unease evident in the way he adjusted his robes repeatedly. Finally, he called for another recess, the gavel's crack echoing like a warning shot, and as the room began to stir with relieved exhalations, he caught my arm lightly in the aisle, pulling me toward his chambers, with a discreet nod to the bailiff, murmuring under his breath that we needed to discuss my involvement privately before things spiraled further, his face a mask of professional duty cracked by the personal dread of dredging up our entangled past, leaving Daniel to watch us go with wide-eyed concern, while Lisa's family exchanged frantic glances that screamed of secrets teetering on the edge of exposure, ready to tumble into the open at the slightest push. Harlan's chambers enveloped us in a cocoon of dim light filtering through half-drawn blinds, the air thick with the musty aroma of aged law volumes and the faint trace of his aftershave, a scent that transported me instantly back to those tentative evenings 25 years ago when we'd both navigated the raw edges of grief in the community center's backroom, his wife freshly buried from a lingering cancer battle, and my husband gone in a blink from the heart attack that upended our world, leaving me to stitch together a life for Daniel amid the chaos of hospital condolences and funeral casseroles that tasted like ash on the tongue. He closed the door with a soft, definitive click that sealed us away from the hallway's prying ears, where I could almost picture Mark hovering like a shadow, eager to intercept any whisper that might tip the scales in this trial, and paced slowly across the threadbare carpet, his hands clasped behind his back as he fixed me with a gaze that blended judicial sternness with the flicker of old familiarity, asking outright what I thought I was doing by showing up unannounced in his courtroom after all these years of maintaining a careful distance from the circles we'd once shared in Jefferson City, where small-town connections could either anchor you or drag you under depending on how the tides of fortune turned. I held his stare without flinching, reminding him gently of the fragile support we'd offered each other during those group sessions, swapping stories of loss over vending machine coffee, and how I'd confided in him about the financial strains of raising Daniel alone, while he admitted the temptations to bend rules in his early legal practice to ease the burdens on his family, the same vulnerabilities that now loomed over this divorce, like storm clouds gathering over the river valley, and I explained That my presence stemmed not from malice, but from the desperate need to shield Daniel from Lisa's calculated dismantling of his character. Her smirks in court echoing the dismissal she'd hurled for years about his job at the auto shop being a dead end compared to her banking promotions that came with corner offices and networking lunches. Harlan nodded, slowly absorbing my words, but his expression tightened when I mentioned the deeper undercurrents involving Lisa's family, their construction business having benefited from zoning leniencies he'd granted in his rookie years under pressure from Carla's influential circle. A favor whispered in confidence during one of our late-night talks that I'd filed away not as leverage, but as a marker of how power imbalances could sour even the best intentions, and I added with a wry edge of humor that it was ironic how the woman who'd once lectured me on family values at church socials now sat across the aisle trying to strip Daniel of custody over Sophie, as if blood ties were negotiable like a business contract. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples, and urged me to tread carefully in my testimony, warning that dredging up ancient history could disqualify him from the case and complicate everything for the little girl at the center. But before we could delve further, the bailiff knocked, signaling the recess's end, and we emerged back into the fray. The courtroom's murmurs swelling like a congregation before the sermon as seats filled and eyes started curiously between us, Lisa's family exchanging loaded glances that suggested they'd spent the break plotting their next move, with Mark already thumbing through a fresh stack of papers that looked suspiciously like unearthed records from the county archives. The proceedings reignited with Mark calling his surprise witness a former colleague of Daniel's from the auto shop who, under oath, recounted exaggerated tales of my son's temper during stressful shifts, painting him as volatile and unfit for stable parenting, while conveniently omitting the context of long hours and understaffing that had tested everyone's patience. The testimony, designed to bolster Lisa's claims of emotional neglect, her nod of approval from the table radiating that smug assurance that money and connections could rewrite narratives to fit the villain they needed Daniel to be. When my turn came for cross on the witness stand, I countered with measured precision, drawing out admissions from the man about how Daniel had covered for him during personal crises like a divorce of his own, offering quiet advice and extra shifts without fanfare. Revelation that humanized my son and chipped away at the caricature Mark was building. Yet the real stroke of witty revenge came when I pivoted to question the witness about industry standards, slipping in details I'd gleaned from nursing friends married to mechanics regarding ethical lapses in parts procurement at certain firms, including hints of the very suppliers tied to Lisa's family business, where shortcuts had allegedly cut corners on safety to boost profits. Mark's face drained of color as the implications sank in, his objection overruled by Harlan, who allowed the line of questioning to stand, the room buzzing with speculation about potential conflicts that extended beyond this marriage into broader accountability, making Carla shift uncomfortably in her seat, her pearls clicking like nervous beads, while Lisa's composure cracked with a sharp intake of breath, the satisfaction of landing that blow warming me from within like a shot of good whiskey on a cold night. But almost immediately the moral dilemma twisted in my gut as Sophie was led in for her brief statement, her voice quivering through descriptions of the yelling matches and slammed doors that had become household norms, her innocent confusion about why mommy and daddy couldn't just fix things, laying bare how my escalations might be prolonging the division, scarring her tender heart with fragments of adult vendettas that no child should inherit. Watching her small figure retreat with the advocate tugged at something deep, making me question if my clever jabs at Mark's integrity were truly justice or just another layer of fallout, burying the path to healing for everyone involved, a choice that would likely draw disapproval from those hearing this story, wondering why I'd prioritize payback over the swift resolution Sophie deserved. Yet the internal tug-of-war only heightened my determination as the session dragged toward afternoon, with evidence mounting about forged signatures on loan docs, Lisa's handiwork, but looped back to Daniel's supposed oversight, threatening countersuits that could tie him up for years. Harlan adjourned for the day, his gavel falling with finality, but as we filtered into the hallway, Carla cornered me near the water fountain, her voice a venomous hiss accusing me of poisoning the well with half-truths dredged from the past, and in her agitation she waved a crumpled envelope, pulled from her purse a faded letter dated from our support group era, addressed to Harlan in my handwriting, warning him about A shady land deal involving her family's firm, the very clue that tied our histories together, now exposed in their frantic search through old files, her eyes blazing with the realization that this discovery could unravel not just the trial, but the carefully constructed facade of their untouchable status, leaving me to walk out into the fading daylight with Daniel's arm linked in mine, the weight of impending confrontation hanging heavier than the humid Missouri air, promising storms, both literal and figurative, on the horizon. The final morning of the trial dawned under a blanket of low-hanging clouds that pressed down on Jefferson City, like the collective weight of unspoken regrets carried by everyone shuffling into the courthouse steps, their footsteps muffled on the damp pavement, as if the town itself held its breath, anticipating the unraveling of secrets that had festered for decades in the fertile soil of family feuds and overlooked favors exchanged in dimly lit diners after town council meetings, where Harlan and I had first crossed paths, not as judge and witness, but as two souls adrift in the aftermath of profound losses. His wife's slow fade from cancer mirroring the sudden void left by my husband's heart attack, both of us finding solace in those anonymous support circles that promised anonymity but rarely delivered in a place as interconnected as this Missouri heartland. I arrived early, slipping into my seat behind Daniel, who looked more resolute than weary after a night of fitful phone calls from Sophie asking when she could come home for good, his grip on my hand conveying a mix of gratitude and lingering bewilderment about the undercurrents I'd stirred with Harlan the previous day, while Lisa entered with a brittle poise, her earlier smirks replaced by tight-lipped determination, flanked by Carla clutching that damning folder of unearthed documents, and Mark striding ahead with the purposeful gait of a man who'd spent hours on calls to colleagues digging for leverage to disqualify the judge before the gavel could fall in our favor. Harlan took the bench, his robes settling around him like a shroud as he called the room to order, the gavel's sharp crack slicing through the humid air thick with the scent of rain-soaked coats and nervous perspiration, and immediately Mark launched into his closing argument, a torrent of accusations framing Daniel as the architect of their marital collapse, with forged receipts and manipulated statements that painted him as deceitful and unfit, waving the very envelope Carla had brandished yesterday as proof of Harlan's bias tied to my letter from 25 years back, a calculated move to taint the proceedings and force a mistrial that would drag out the agony for Sophie and leave Daniel's custody hopes dangling like bait on a hook. Lisa nodded along her family's united front, amplifying every barb with subtle gestures that screamed entitlement born from years of Carla's construction empire, shielding them from accountability, while I sat seething, the injustice coiling in my chest like smoke from a smoldering fire ready to ignite into something that would either save my son or consume us all in the blaze of exposed truths that no one had bargained for when the divorce papers were first filed 6 months earlier. Daniel's lawyer countered with a measured rebuttal, highlighting the evidence of Lisa's financial indiscretions, the unauthorized withdrawals, and affair-linked expenses that had hollowed out their savings, but the argument felt tepid against Mark's onslaught until Harlan interrupted with a request for sidebar, the attorneys huddling at his bench in urgent whispers that left the room speculating in hushed tones about potential bombshells, while I caught fragments of Harlan's strained voice mentioning recusal and procedural integrity, his pallor deepening to match the storm clouds outside, as if the weight of our shared history pressed harder now that it teetered on the brink of public scrutiny. Emerging from the huddle, Harlan addressed the court directly, his voice steady, but laced with an undercurrent of finality, explaining that my earlier testimony had raised legitimate concerns about impartiality stemming from our acquaintance in the support group era, where I'd offered unsolicited advice on a land deal involving Carla's firm, a favor that skirted ethical lines in his early career days when grief clouded judgments and small-town pressures bent even the straightest backs. The revelation hung in the air, drawing gasps from the spectators as Lisa's family froze, Carla's folder trembling in her lap, the letter slipping partially free to reveal my familiar script warning Harlan about the zoning scam that could have derailed his judicial path if exposed, a secret I'd kept not for leverage but out of a misplaced loyalty to the man who'd listened to my widow's laments without judgment, yet now weaponized in this crucible of family warfare, making Mark's face twist in outrage as he demanded immediate dismissal of the case. In that charged instant, I rose prompted by Harlan's subtle nod, my voice cutting through the chaos with calm precision, recounting how Lisa's courtroom mockery wasn't isolated cruelty, but a symptom of her family's long pattern of manipulation from Carla's arm twisting on those early deals to the way they'd undermined Daniel's role as a father, dismissing his steady presence in Sophie's life as insufficient compared to their vision of success measured in bank balances and status symbols, adding a touch of dark humor about how some folks treated marriage vows like optional clauses in a contract renegotiable when inconvenient, while others, like my son, honored them through scraped-together birthdays and midnight fevers, tended with quiet devotion. The room erupted in murmurs as I revealed the full scope of the land deal's fallout, how Carla's pressure had led to shortcuts that endangered workers on their sites, a detail I'd pieced together from nursing colleagues treating the injuries and held onto as quiet justice, waiting for a moment like this to tip the scales, not through outright blackmail, but through the light of truth that exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of their accusations against Daniel. Harlan absorbed it all, his expression a mosaic of resignation and resolve, and in a ruling that delivered my ultimate witty revenge, he denied the recusal motion, citing the irrelevance of ancient history to the merits of the case, then sided decisively with Daniel on custody, awarding primary placement with Sophie and equitable asset division that stripped Lisa of the windfall she'd schemed for, his gavel falling like thunder as the courtroom dissolved into stunned silence, broken only by Mark's futile objections and Carla's sharp intake of breath, Lisa's face crumpling into something raw and defeated, her family's phalanx scattering like startled birds under the clearing sky outside. Satisfaction coursed through me as Daniel pulled me into a fierce hug, Sophie rushing from the back to wrap her arms around us, both her giggles cutting through the tension like sunlight-piercing clouds. But as we stepped into the crisp afternoon air, the ambiguity settled in heavy and unresolved. Had my dredging up of those buried ties truly liberated my son, or merely traded one set of scars for another, shadowing Harlan's reputation and prolonging the ripples of distrust through Sophie's world, where mommy's smirks and grandma's vendettas blurred into a confusing tapestry that might haunt her holidays for years to come, a choice that would leave listeners to this tale disagreeing with the gray morality I'd embraced, wondering if the cost of clever payback outweighed the fleeting triumph, leaving me to drive home along Interstate 70 with the radio humming softly. Unanswered questions lingering like the faint scent of rain on the dashboard, if justice in family battles ever came without collateral damage, or if some roots ran too deep to pull without tearing up the whole garden.